Another issue in the 20th century related to Christianity and culture or society is environmentalism. In March of 1967, Science magazine published an article by a historian named Lynn White, and it was entitled "The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis." Now, essentially, the 1960s, the 1970s, a lot of people became more concerned about, especially in the United States, but in Western civilization in general, the ways in which we were treating and looking at the environment and some of the consequences of that. Still something, of course, that we have a lot of concern about, but in the 1960s and 70s, there wasn't the emphasis on recycling, there wasn't the emphasis on sustainable energy, sustainable food, right? All the kind of things that we hear about today, even though they're still in their early stages of being developed. But in the 1960s and 70s, especially with the proliferation of nuclear energy, with the growing, eventually acid rain issues, and some other things where the environment was being affected, people began to be more concerned. In his article, White argued that the ecological problems of the contemporary period, right, the middle of the 20th century, we were facing those because of Christian conceptions about the environment. Right? That all of it could be traced back to how Christians had thought of the environment. From the time of Francis Bacon, who we talked about way back in the 17th century, Christians, argued White, looked at the creation account of Genesis and saw those passages that said, God created human beings to have dominion over the earth. And White argued Christians took this as a carte blanche proviso that they could treat the environment however they would like, because God had given the environment to humanity for dominion. And so this attitude of dominion over the earth, combined with the developing technologies from the 1600s on, had caused Westerners, White argued, to ignore the consequences of their activities on the environment. We didn't think about that because we had this idea of dominion. He also, in his article, pointed to alternatives within Christianity that could change some of this mindset, particularly the views of Francis of Assisi, a 13th century monk held in high regard within Catholicism. His views of nature and seeing creation as brothers and sisters. In fact, a biography of him, a biographical movie of him, was called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. Right? So Assisi had this kind of notion of the family of all creation, and that God's divinity, God's divine nature, is in all creation. And so White said, if Christians adopted that mindset more fully, we could reverse some of the problems that we're finding in society, in environment. And so a lot of environmentalists, however, accepted White's position. The environmental crisis was due to certain strands of Christian theology, and that any religious solution to the environment problem had to come from non-Christian sources. And so a lot of people turn to things like Buddhism or Native American traditions as the key on how to have a proper response to the environment. There was even a TV commercial in the 70s. You might be able to find it still on YouTube, where here are these people driving in this convertible down the highway, and they're pitching trash out of their car, and you kind of see this. The camera pans, and you see this trash, and then it pans up, and here's this Native American, right? Stereotypical Native American garb. He's not actually Native American, right? The actor wasn't. And it pans up, and here's this tear just going down his cheek because of what the Westerners have done to the American continent. Right? And so this idea that Native American traditions or Buddhism, something like that, could solve the problem, not Christianity. Other Christians, however, argued that what the Bible taught was not dominion, but stewardship. And so you had a lot of Christians who were active in environmental concerns, and a lot of people still today. But we still see this divide, even among Christians, over things like climate change, the effect of human beings on the environment, and what role should government have in regulating all of those things. And so a lot of it is still around here festering, which does raise an interesting question, especially for Christians, is what is the biblical perspective on the environment, and what should we be doing with respect to the environment, let alone the whole issue of climate change. But certainly I would say, at the very least, we see, right, whether or not we can say, yes, we have dominion, we do have stewardship. And so stewardship definitely is a biblical concept. The question of dominion, it depends, again, on how you define it. So a lot of technological changes that had impact on the environment, technological changes also had impact on the presentation of the message. And so as technology developed in the 20th century, ministers, churches continued to find ways to use that technology to spread the message. Some people and some technologies were more successful than others. But as radio developed, Christians got on the radio. As television developed, Christians got on television. With the rise and the proliferation of the internet, social media, again, with all these technological changes, Christians are out there trying to use them to present the message. Since we're talking about the 20th century, we'll be focusing on television predominantly. With the creation of television, ministers attempted to get on it to provide religious broadcasting. This would be maybe the broadcast of worship services. It might just be a preacher there standing delivering a message. But essentially, the idea was get the message out to people through religious broadcasting. Now, at one point, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, had gotten involved in trying to regulate the presentation of the message, and at various times, a lot of the people that controlled religious broadcasting were more liberal Protestants. And so there's been a lot of things of evangelicals, fundamentalists having to pay for time. And so there's a lot of other things we could talk about. And I just want to focus on televangelism. Some of these ministries became quite famous. Their ministers becoming almost celebrities. At some point, someone coined the term televangelist to describe these celebrity ministers, right? They are evangelists on television, they are televangelists. But the term was often a pejorative. Right? It wasn't used positively most of the time. Largely because a lot of the people that became the most famous were often the people that throughout their services were asking the audience to send money into them to help support the ministry. And so that's part of the reason it got such a negative outlook, and often a lot of these televangelists had these very extreme personas, right, that were very easy to make fun of, very easy to caricature, because they were very over the top, they were very, they were moving, they were making quite a spectacle of themselves at different times, and so it's no surprise that evangelists on television got a bad name, even though there were quite a few that weren't like that. Many of the most successful televangelists also claimed healing powers. And so they would have these services broadcast of people standing in lines who would be coming for healing, who supposedly were healed by the minister there. There were some even who claimed that they could heal through the television set. And so their audience at home could experience healing based on the faith that they had. just talk about just a few of these famous ones here in the predominantly 1970s, 1980s. Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Swaggart was born in the 1930s and was a Pentecostal. We'll talk about Pentecostalism next Monday. But with Pentecostalism, very much a belief in the continued activity of the Holy Spirit in certain gifts, particularly the speaking in tongues and the gift of healing. So this is the background that Swaggart comes from. Eventually he starts a television ministry that does become quite successful. He's also a musician, actually a cousin of rock and roll musician Jerry Lee Lewis, who was quite famous for Great Balls of Fire and his persona and some other things as well. So he becomes very popular. Another popular televangelist during this time is a man named Jerry Falwell. Falwell was a Baptist. And so the services and the things that Falwell televised were more standard, mainstream, moderate sermons. He started preaching in Lynchburg, Virginia, in Thomas Road Baptist Church. Started a radio and then a television ministry that was quite successful. And then actually went out and started a college, also in Lynchburg. It's now known as Liberty University. Depending on what you look at and what you search for, you may have seen their ads on YouTube popping up. Liberty University online. Falwell was a separatist fundamentalist, and so he was very fundamental, very conservative, and also a segregationist. But eventually he does change some of those views. And so when he starts as segregationist, but by the 1980s, he has changed his views on that. Largely apolitical until the 1970s, not involved in politics much. In fact, he had preached a sermon, as I mentioned the other day, saying ministers shouldn't be involved in politics, predominantly targeted at Martin Luther King. But he would eventually be persuaded to form the moral majority that we talked about in the politics section. Third of very popular televangelist during this time was a man named Pat Robertson. Robertson was educated at Yale Law School, but decided to go into the ministry. He had grown up Baptist, but eventually becomes almost Pentecostal in the 1950s. In 1960, he purchased a television station and starts the Christian Broadcasting Network. The key program of CBN was the 700 Club. And the name came from those early years of looking for 700 members to donate $10 a month to help with the expenses of the program with the network. Eventually, he would expand the TV ministry. He would start a university, Regents University is the name of that school. Eventually renamed it to the Family Channel, with the 700 Club still being very important to that. The Family Channel had, of course, the 700 Club, other types of religious programming, and then family movies and family programs. Eventually, though, the Family Channel was becoming too profitable, that the ministry aspect of it was in danger of losing its non-profit status because it was making so much money. And so he sold it off. He sold it to Rupert Murdoch for $200 million with the requirement that the 700 Club would still be broadcast twice a day. Murdoch named it Foxstamp. The condition for the 700 Club remained in force even when it was sold to Disney, who rebranded it as ABC Family. And so that's why, if you've ever been watching ABC Family in the night or in the morning, here comes the 700 Club. It's just, how does this relate to some of the other programming? Well, it's because of the condition and all the contracts of this selling of this has got to remain a part of the broadcast day. And it's also why ABC Family has that disclaimer. The views of the 700 Club are not those of ABC Family. And so, it comes from this ministry that becomes a little bit too profitable. The last minister, last televangelist I want to talk about is Jim Baker. His ministry was known as the PTL Club, which stood for Praise the Lord. He and his wife, Tammy Faye Baker, tended to be on the more extreme end. Tammy Faye had really big hair, wore a lot of makeup, and so these people were some of the ones that were the most targeted for caricature, for criticism. In addition to their television ministry, they also started a Christian theme park called Heritage USA, which would serve as a destination for Christians to visit, that would have some things about the Christian nature of the United States, as well as rides and other things like you would think of with a theme park. Essentially kind of a Christian alternative to Disney World, almost, but certainly never the scale. Heritage USA is actually closed down now, and I was just reading something a couple months ago, and it's still kind of there, right? The buildings are still there. There have been attempts by people to buy it, sell it, but right now it's just kind of an abandoned place. Largely because of a lot of things that plagued televangelists, including the Bakers, and that's a variety of scandals. And so the scandals that televangelists were involved in also led to people looking at it as very negative. Several of the scandals that televangelists were involved in had to do with the amount of money coming into these ministries. Sometimes they were bringing in millions of dollars from their audience. Now, in some cases, those funds were handled well, appropriately. They were handled with financial honesty and ethics. In other cases, ministries were accused of financial misdealings, tax evasion. Jim Baker actually is also goes to prison because of some tax issues and tax evasion. There were also tensions between evangelists, as evangelists kind of competed to try and take other ministries down, which kind of seems, how does that fit into Christianity? If you're a sincere Christian, what are you trying to do to take this other minister down? But people would try to trap other televangelists in some sort of scandal, to frame them in some sort of misdealing. There were also a variety of sexual indiscretions, affairs. Swaggart was caught with prostitutes twice, and it was his very public confession the first time was broadcast. It too you can probably find on YouTube if you type in Jimmy Swaggart, I've sinned, or Jimmy Swaggart's confession or something like that. Baker as well was also caught in an affair. So with this power that came with the televangelism came the money, came the downfall of a lot of these individuals, even though you can certainly find televangelists still on religious programming. But televangelism becomes part of this kind of mixing of culture and Christianity, trying to use popular culture, trying to use media to spread the message. What questions do you have about either televangelism or any of the other things we've talked about with culture and society?